No, this is not it. Honestly, I don't know what I just read. This is nuts. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and I like to review books. So every Monday I usually do a review of all the books that I've read in the last week. And I normally do a reading prompt for the month. So for February I've been doing King Family February, and I've been reading books that were written by Stephen King and also members of Stephen King's family. So we're now in the final week. I've just finished reading the final books for this reading prompt. So we're going to go ahead and start reviewing those now. Now, when I left you at the end of last week, I had just finished King Sorrow by Joe Hill, and I'd been really impressed with that book. I thought it was really good. And so for the final week, I decided that I was going to move on and read another Stephen King book. But I had like 3 that I was trying to choose from. So I did a random pick out of 3 pieces of paper of the 3 that I was interested in and picked out The Eyes of the Dragon. Now I was actually really pleased about this because I think it couldn't have come at a better time. After having read Joe Hill's King Sorrow, which is about a dragon, I thought well, actually it's really good now to get the opportunity to read Stephen King's dragon story as well, because to my knowledge he's only ever written one. The only fantasy that I'm aware of that Stephen King has really written is In the Eyes of the Dragon. There's another book called The Tommyknockers, and then obviously the Dark Tower series, which you can just see behind me here. Now, I've read the first 2 books of the Dark Tower series, so this is only my 3rd book of Stephen King's where he's written fantasy, although this is written slightly different from the Dark Tower series. So this book was published in 1984, and I think it reads a little bit differently to his other to Stephen King's other books, and I think part of the reason for that is the fact that he's writing in the second person perspective. So imagine if you ever watch Bridgerton and it's like dear reader and like invites you into the story. That's exactly what the narrator is doing in this book. So normally Stephen King's books are written from 3rd person perspective, which is quite normal for most books. So we tend to find second person perspective is usually used in fairy tale tellings, to be honest, and that's the way that this is written. It's written as a sort of fairy tale, whereas King Sorrow by Joe Hill is not written in the same way. Now, I had a few, I was a bit worried when I went into King Sorrow. I'm not really into the whole dragons flying around everywhere, that sort of fantasy. That's not really my thing. That wasn't really what was happening in King Sorrow, so I was grateful for that, and that's not really what's happening in here, even though it's sort of being told as a fairy story. So the dragon is essentially already dead at the beginning of this book, and its head is mounted on a wall. And there are peepholes in the eyes of this dragon. So really the story is about what people are seeing when they look through the peepholes into the room that they're looking into. So that's really where the title of the story comes from. I think I can say that really because I don't think that's really to do with the main part of the story, so it's not really spoiling anything for anybody. So in this book we are following a couple of main characters. So we've got 2 princes, and essentially the king, the father, dies, and one of them has to take the throne. Obviously that's not going to be easy in this fairy story, and to add to the trouble that's going on, we have an advisor in this court called Flag, who is actually a magician, and nobody has really cottoned on that Flag is like years old, because he sort of advises whichever king is in power at the time for, maybe a decade or whatever, and then he'll disappear, and then he'll come back at a later time and look completely different. So nobody's actually cottoned on that this is the same person, keeps returning to the kingdom over and over again. So Flag is the main protagonist. And this is what I find actually really interesting. I'm really glad I read this now, because the character of Flag is actually mentioned in the Dark Tower series. When we open up with the gunslinger, we actually it opens up with the gunslinger is following the dark man across the desert, and actually that dark man is actually Flag, apparently. So I'd obviously missed out on that when I read the gunslinger, because obviously I had not read this, so I hadn't realised that there was a relationship. However, if you were reading this in publication order, you still wouldn't realise there was a relationship. So this is where I think it's quite interesting, because, The Gunslinger was written in 1982 and this was written in 1984. So this is 2 years later. So you know, one of the main characters in here, the protagonist Flag, who has the bigger stage really in this book compared to the gunslinger, you know, is actually playing a role in a book, you know, published 2 years before. So I do sort of wonder if Stephen King was actually writing The Gunslinger and this book at the same time. It's just that this one got published 2 years later. Or if he took inspiration from The Gunslinger and decided that he wanted to make something of that character and put him into this book. Now, The Drawing of the Three, which is the second book in the Dark Tower series, was written in 1987. And there's a reference to two characters in there as a kind of passing scene. There's actually the two characters from here as well. So it feels like this book contains characters which are mentioned in the Dark Tower series. So if you are reading the Dark Tower series, getting a read of this is probably quite important early on. However, as I said, if you had been following Stephen King's books as they were being published, you wouldn't have actually got to read this one to understand Flag's involvement until 2 years after The Gunslinger had actually been published. So I think that that's worth mentioning, that this is tied into a little bit into the Dark Tower series, with the fact that there's characters making appearances in the two books that I've already read from the Dark Tower series. Now, I haven't read the rest of the books in the Dark Tower series, so I can't say if those characters continue to make appearances. I'm assuming the Dark Man that the Gunslinger is chasing across the desert is going to make further appearances in the series, but with regards to the other characters, I don't know. So I think that's like an important piece of information to share if you are thinking about reading the Dark Tower series. With regards to how much I liked this book, I didn't mind this book. It was quite an easy read. It was quite a peaceful read. It's very different from the other things that he's written, if I'm honest, because it's not really any sort of suspense or paranormal horror or anything like that. It's, you know, there's a murder and it's a he said, she said sort of situation, written in the style of a fairy tale, albeit probably a slightly bit of a creepier fairy tale than anything Disney has got out there at the moment. But you know, it was generally an enjoyable read, but I don't think it's my favourite of Stephen King's work. And this might just be because I'm not a huge fan of fantasy. So, you know, I think I probably would prefer his more, you know, Castle Rock paranormal type horror things like, you know, The Dead Zone and The Dark Half and Needful Things. I really enjoyed those kind of books. I just think that's more my thing. So I don't think there's anything wrong with this. And I think that if you have never read a Stephen King book before and you read this as your first book and you really liked it, you might get a bit of a surprise then when you read his other books. But I also think it's nice when authors kind of try to break out of their comfort zone and do something else. So yeah, this is not a terrible book. It's just not my favourite book out of the ones that I've read. But I say I would recommend it as to, you know, so you can get a bigger picture of the Dark Tower universe that Stephen King has created and the characters in it, because obviously this book seems to be quite important towards that. With regards to King's Sorrow that Joe Hill wrote, which is a dragon story, compared to this dragon story, The Eyes of the Dragon, that Stephen King written, I think my preferred one out of the two is King's Sorrow by Joe Hill. I just think that the story is probably more mature in that, if I'm honest. I think on the whole, you know, I wouldn't be against reading this again, but it wouldn't be the first thing that I picked to read. So I think I'm probably going to rate this about a 3.75. You know, not bad, just not my favourite. So the next book that I read, I was thinking, oh, I'll read another Stephen King. But a couple of weeks ago, I read Small World by Tabitha King. And if you have watched that video, you'll know how much I really enjoyed that book. I thought it was absolutely fantastic and exceeded all of my expectations, and I gave it a 5-star. It was the only thing that I've ever read by Tabitha King, and I was really desperate to try and get hold of some other work of hers. Now, it's quite hard in the UK because we didn't have access to Signet publishers, which are the people who seem to publish most of her work, and she's not actually currently in production by publication by Signet. I don't even know if Signet still exists as a publisher, if I'm honest, but yeah, like, she hasn't been published for quite some time, so her old work. She's got about 8 fiction novels. They're quite hard to come by unless you can find them secondhand. And in America, this is much easier because obviously they were published in America, but the shipping fees from America on these books is actually quite big. So I've been trying to track down copies in the UK or in Europe. Now, I did find one of Tabitha King's books on a secondhand website in Germany, and at first I thought, oh, it'll probably be written in German, but actually it said that it was going to be written in English. So I ordered it, but it still took some time to arrive. Fortunately for me, just after I finished reading The Eyes of the Dragon, before I'd had chance to pick another Stephen King book to read, it came through in the post. So obviously it was meant to be that I had to then finish off King Family February with one of Tabitha King's novels. So this is The Trap, and this was published in 1985. Now, not all of her novels are thrillers from what I can tell, but I was mainly interested in her thrillers because A Small World was like a horror thriller. And when I googled which were the other thrillers, this came up as one of the other thrillers. So I was really, really excited to get into this. And actually, I read it within 2 days. It's about 350 pages long, and I just, I enjoyed her other book so much, I really wanted to get into this. However, as you've probably seen by the intro, all was not fantastic with this book, so I think it's worth having a bit of a discussion about it. So we'll start off with the premise first. So in this book, we are following a lady called Olivia Russell, and she lives in, basically Tabitha King has made up a little town in Maine in the same way that Stephen King has made up Castle Rock. So apparently a lot of books of hers are set in, I think it's called Northridge, this little town that she's made up. And Northridge is kind of a place where people have holiday homes because it's right next to a lake. So Olivia Russell has a holiday home there with her husband, and they visit there with their 2 children. So they have one teenage daughter, and then they have a 3-year-old called Travis, who sort of seems to turn into a 4-year-old during the story. Now, Tabitha King is really, really good at setting a scene. So, I had got to nearly the halfway mark in this book, reading about, the fact that this woman was unhappy in her marriage, and, all of the problems that her husband had, and, her children, and, what they thought of their parents. And, they went on a couple of holidays to this holiday home, but they only visit there, tends to be in the summer. And, it's quite heartwarming. She writes the scenes well, she writes the characters well, so, you don't mind. But, when I'm sort of getting to like 175 pages out of a 350 page book, and I'm like, okay, when is the main event happening? Now, there's a prologue at the start of this book, which is quite a violent prologue that happens between Olivia and the local, like, bullies, I guess we would call them, but like adults. And you sort of, and then you also reading that this book is about a home invasion, but no home invasion has happened. And then, so you're thinking like, well, when's this main event going to happen? Because this story is just like bumbling along, talking about these people's lives, which, as I said, she's not a bad writer, so it's not horrible to read about. But, I was reading for some action, like I'm looking to read a thriller. And eventually, this home invasion happens just after the halfway mark. But then our main character is not even aware that she's in a home invasion until page 199. And I think that, in a 350 page book, you should not start the actual event off at like 200 pages in. I felt that the pacing was really off for this book, for that to be the case, because a thriller's meant to be a thriller. Like, you're meant to be thrilled really from, almost the start of reading it. And the thing is, as I said, I read this in 2 days. So in a way, it wasn't bad for me. I spent one whole day of reading and didn't get to any main event, and it didn't really start to happen until, the second day that I read. But some people don't have the time to read at that speed and that amount in a day. So if you were reading 20 to 30 pages a day, or you only got to read on your commute, you could be reading this book for like nearly 2 weeks before anything has actually happened. So, from a pacing perspective, I can totally see why people might give up on this book before anything really happened. And I did go on to Goodreads afterwards just to see, what people were thinking of that. And yet there were a couple of people that did have do not finish because like nothing's happening in this book. And I totally get that. I think, you know, the only reason that I sort of carried on going with this is because it's quite hard for me to get hold of. Like, it took a lot of effort for me to get hold of it, and I enjoyed her first book so much, and her writing's not bad. But yeah, no, that is too much to go 200 pages before we get into the main event. There was really no need for all of that. The other thing that I found odd with this book is we have this little boy called Travis, who's 3 years old, and he doesn't call his parents mum and dad. He calls them by their first name, but in all the talking that we're doing about Travis, it's not like he's not their child or anything. He is their child. We never really have an explanation as to why he doesn't call his parents mum and dad. He calls his mother once when he's scared over something. He calls her mum, but for the rest of the time he refers to her as, you know, Olivia, like Livia, which I found like really bizarre. But also I found the speech for this 3-year-old to be far too sophisticated for a 3-year-old. You know, like the way that he tries to comfort his mother at times during this, or just some of the things he comes out with, I like a 3-year-old would not have those language skills as far as I'm concerned. So I found the child in this, the 3-year-old, quite hard to believe because I didn't, despite the fact she's done loads of like, you know, writing about these characters to bring them to life and for us to understand their family dynamics, I actually really didn't understand what the 3-year-old was about, other than to have a small child that she felt, you know, that was sort of helpless, that she felt that she had to protect. So I feel like more could have been done with this 3-year-old to situate him in the story properly. I personally felt like he was just reading like he was a prop more than, you know, an actual, you know, real character in this. One thing I would say about this story, if you are interested in picking up and reading it, there is a very graphic scene of a sexual assault on a woman in this book as well, which I did know about before going in because I had read that in reviews before I'd picked up the book, so I was prepared for it. So I just think that that's worth mentioning. With regards to what happened after we actually, you know, got the home invasion, it's actually kicked off and, you know, the main event was happening, I felt that it got really far-fetched. Like, the people involved in this, like, they just seem to be going too far, you know? And again, I was finding it a little bit hard to believe by the end that the people causing the trouble would go to the extent that they were, you know, going to. Yeah, so that, yeah, it just felt like a little bit much. And then there's another character in this series, this book, who is causing trouble right at the end of the book, who's mentioned a little bit in relation to a party, this elderly woman, and then she has something to do at the end of this book. And again, like, it's so far-fetched, like, her part in this story, that I'm like, I'm not sure that we understood her well enough for this to be carried off as believable, you know. So a lot of my problem with this book is we did 200 pages of writing about these characters and us understanding family life, and then 2 of the characters were just totally unbelievable. The protagonists were a little bit unbelievable, you know, and it just took too long to kick off. However, one thing that I'm really glad about from reading this book is that the main characters, like the protagonists, the main protagonists in this book, their surname was Nicewander. So I can't remember what the father was called, but the sons were called Ricky and Randy Nicewander. Now, if you remember from my review last week of King Sorrow, I said the protagonists in this book were called Nicewander, and I actually commented that I thought that was a great name because in that book we had the mother, Daphne Nicewander, and then we had her daughters, Jane and Tana Nicewander. So again, I had not thought that when Joe Hill was writing King Sorrow that he would actually be leaving Easter eggs for Tabitha King's books. I'd obviously picked up the ones, or some of the ones that he had put in there for Stephen King's novels, but I had no idea he was leaving any for Tabitha King's novels. And having only ever read one of hers before, obviously I'd not realised that, but clearly he had left an Easter egg in there for this. Because I don't think it can be a mistake that the main protagonist in this book are a man and his 2 sons called Nicewander, and then, you know, in King Sorrow our 3 protagonists are a mother and her, you know, 2 daughters under the name of Nicewander. So I definitely think that Joe Hill was nodding to this, and I would say that the Nicewanders, you know, in both King Sorrow and in this book, act like unhinged lunatics. Absolutely, totally. So yeah, I don't think that that's a surprise. I think that I don't think it was you know, an accident. I think that that was done on purpose from Joe Hill. So again, in a way, it was nice to find an Easter egg. But would I recommend this book? No, not really. I don't think that this is the same quality of writing of what I found in the first book I read, which was Small World. I think Small World was far more cohesive. The pacing was absolutely bang on, and the horror of the story was absolutely bang on. Whereas this, the pacing was just totally off. If you don't have much time to read, then yeah, don't pick this up, because you know you're gonna have to be reading for quite some time before anything really happens. And yeah, it's just the events and the characters were just not believable enough, which was disappointing considering how long, you know, Tabitha spent writing about these characters before the main event kicked off. So I think overall, you know, if I was going to give this a rating, I think I would give it about a 2.5, because it's not on my list to read again anytime soon. The only time I think I'd be reading it is maybe for reference, you know, if I noticed Easter eggs in any more of Joe Hill's books and just wanted to reference back to this to see if there was anything in it. So yeah, this was a little bit of a disappointment, if I'm honest. However, I'm not going to write Tabitha King off with that, because obviously Small World was an absolutely fantastic book. This one just wasn't quite to my expectations. I think I had high expectations after Small World, and that might be why I feel worse about this book as well, because it just, yeah, I'd gone in like, yeah, this author is fantastic. But you know, not every book that an author writes that you like can be your favourite book. And I think this is where it's quite interesting as well, because I really like Stephen King's work. He's one of my favourite authors. But when we started off on King Family February, I started off reading The Gunslinger. And I'd said The Gunslinger is probably one of my least favourite novels that Stephen King has written. You know, but that doesn't mean that I'm just going to say, right, I'm not interested in his work. You know, and even with Joe Hill, when I read him back in October, I read his debut novel Heart-Shaped Box, and I really wasn't sold by it, to be honest. But I did see there was something in his work, and obviously now I've read King Sorrow, which I thought was a really top novel, really, really good. So yeah, Tabitha King is not a bad writer, but I just don't think that that book was the best for me. So I actually finished reading that book on the Friday, and the King Family February month would have ended on the Saturday. So I had time to begin reading something else if I'd wanted. But I decided not to pick up any more King Family books, because there was no way that I was going to finish a book on the Saturday. So what I decided to do was just plough on with my plans for March and started reading a book for that instead. So we'll just wrap up a little bit on King Family February. I've really enjoyed King Family February, even though the month started off with me reading The Gunslinger, and actually my intro to King Family February was actually I didn't enjoy this book. And, you know, leaving King Family February, the last book I read was The Trap by Tabitha King, and didn't really enjoy that much either. So it's a shame that, you know, starting the month and ending the month have not been on the best note. However, I've read loads of really good books in King Family February that I would recommend in the future. So what I'm going to do is on Thursday, I'm going to do a retrospective of King Family February. And we can actually look at all of the books that I read together, and I'm going to rate them all so I can tell you know which one was my favourite at the end of the month, which one was my least favourite. So we'll go through a ranking of I believe there was 7 from the King family and Stephen King. So we'll go through all 7 of those and give them an actual rating. And I would also like to say that with regards to my overall reading goals for the year, where I'm trying to knock off 90 different reading prompts, which books hit which reading prompt as well, so we can keep track of that. So yeah, that will be a video that will be coming out Thursday, and that will be the last video for this series that I've been doing, which is King Family February. That's not to say that I'm not going to do King Family February again, because I've really actually enjoyed myself doing this, and I really hope that you've enjoyed watching this series as well. So for March time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Miscellaneous March. So I've got quite a lot of books that are kind of building up in my TBR, and they've not really fit any of the prompts that I've set for the last couple of months, but I really want to read them still. So what I've decided I'm going to do for this month is I am going to mood read, and I'm going to pick up whatever I want to read and I'm going to read that, and I'm not going to be constrained by any overall reading prompts. There's going to be a miscellaneous load of authors that get read this month from miscellaneous genres. So I really enjoy historical fiction, I enjoy horror, I enjoy contemporary fiction, and I enjoy literary fiction as well. And I'm not opposed to a little bit of sci-fi if it's coming from Isaac Asimov. I quite like thrillers from time to time as well. So you can expect to see a real mixed bag if you decide to come and join me for my weekly reviews in March. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an idea. As I said, I'm not setting a set TBR for me to work off of, but just so you've got an idea of what I'm currently really wanting to get to at the moment, so you might know what's coming up, is Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. My boyfriend read this first, and then basically we were going to do like co-reading together, so I'm now reading it after him so that we can discuss this book between us. So he finished this some time ago, and I just haven't had the opportunity to pick this up yet. Now I really like Fredrik Backman. I really like his style of writing and his sense of humour. My boyfriend did not enjoy this book, and I used the Saturday that I could have read another King book to actually start this book, and got halfway through it. It's really easy to read. However, I won't review it until our first weekly reviews, which will be next Monday for Miscellaneous March. However, what I will say, on the internet there was quite a divide on this book, with people either really liking it or really disliking it. So I'm interested to see where I'm going to fall by the time I get to the end of this book. So that will definitely be featuring next Monday when we have our weekly catch-up. The other things that I really want to get to is my friend for Christmas had ordered me The Secret Room by Jane Casey, which is the latest in the Maeve Kerrigan series. So it has just finally come out in paperback, and she had pre-ordered that for me as a Christmas present. So I really want to get to this. However, I need to read A Stranger in the Family by Jane Casey, which is the one in the Maeve Kerrigan series before this one. Now I have this thing where I don't like to read the final book in the series because I just don't want the series to be over, because I absolutely love this series. However, Jane Casey is not releasing a Maeve Kerrigan book this year, as far as I can tell. She is releasing a book in June or July, but I think it's a standalone. So as I don't know when we're going to get another Maeve Kerrigan book, I'm just going to actually read these back to back, I think, and get up to date with this series. So I want to be doing that at some point this month. I've recently got a copy of Dissolution by Nicholas Binge. I haven't read his first novel, Ascension, but this one really interested me because it's about memory. So in December I'd read The Memory Police by Yoko Agawa, which looks at memory loss and is a bit of a dystopian type horror story. And this is also a bit of a horror story as well, where we follow a woman who is trying to care for her husband who is losing his mind, but then she finds out that actually somebody is coming and stealing his memories, and she has to go on some kind of journey to prevent that happening. So again, because this is to do with memory and memory loss, which really interests me, this is definitely also on the top of my reading pile to get round to. As I understand it, this is a horror, but I'll let you know after I've read it. And then another couple that I'm just going to mention is The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. So this has been on my radar for some time. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2021, and it's about a pair of twins who are black, and they've basically been growing up separately from each other, and one is living as a black woman and the other one is passing as a white woman. So I'm really interested in what's actually going to end up happening in this book. As I understand it, they both have children, so it's kind of like how their children's lives intersect with those different cultural upbringings. So I think that this sounds really good. I really want to get to that. And then finally, also The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver. So This won the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2010, so it's been out some time, and as you all know, I'm a really massive Barbara Kingsolver fan, so I'm trying to read through her back catalogue, and I received this for Valentine's Day off my boyfriend this year because I didn't have it in my collection, so I think this was an absolute perfect Valentine's present. If you have a book lover in your life, buying books for Valentine's Day always goes down really, really well. So yeah, I really also want to be able to get to this month. So those are not all of the books that are on my agenda, obviously, and I assume that I'm going to read a couple of them from there. I'd like to be able to read all of them if I can, but I still think I've got capacity to read more than that, and I probably will, because as I said, I have no idea what I'm going to be in the mood for. So this pile is what I'm in the mood for today, but who knows about tomorrow. So yeah, if you want to come and join me on Thursday, we will be doing a retrospective on King Family February, a final catch up on all of the books that I read. And then next Monday, as I said, we'll be then doing the book reviews for the prompts for March, which is Miscellaneous March. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please press the thumbs up button. And if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.